Hello, everybody.
Morning.
Morning.
Gallery view here. There you all are. Hello.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. All right, I'm going to take attendance real quick, and then we will get back into our lecture. Participants list, just because it makes it so much easier. Okie dokie. So, today we're going to keep talking about the theory with all the names, social cognitive learning theory. And then I believe Wednesday, you have some readings for that. Let me double check and make sure that is correct. And I'm not telling you the wrong thing. I'm just going to open your syllabus right quick here. All right, taking a look-see. Yep. So might need to finish up the lecture, just depends on how quickly I talk today. And then we will have learning readings. So you have in the book, you have one by Skinner and one by Bandura, so big names. And then on Blackboard, you have 3 fairly short readings. 2 of them are really short and one that's a little longer about the different types of therapy that come out of this particular method. So a couple more people signed on here, so I'm going to make sure I get them checked off here. And then we'll go over behavioral genetics, and then we'll be going into our last exam and then our simulation. So it'll be pretty cool. Anyone have? Oh gosh, yeah. If you're sick and you can't speak, or like Miranda, you had to yell at work, please just rest your voice. If you have any questions, just throw them in the chat. I am totally empathetic with every situation going on right now. I'm actually just like super stoked because my husband started a new job within his workplace. He sort of had a lateral move. And we thought his hours would be such that I was going to have to go get Quinn. And actually he's going to be able to go get her every day. So that makes it easier to meet with you all and things like that. So I'm excited about that. But as I've learned, I cannot click and talk at the same time. So I'm going to take a sec so I can actually get the PowerPoint set up here. Grab my stuff here. Sorry, I usually don't, but I had another meeting from 9 to 10 today. So I'm like running just a smidge behind where I normally am. All right. So we were talking about Bandura, and we were talking about social cognitive theory, and we were going to skip ahead. We were sort of paused because I'm going to start getting into all these charts, and I wanted them to be covered all at once. So today we'll talk more about the therapy implications of these methods. A lot of the modern therapies came out of this. So a lot of the therapies I learned while I was in grad school. So I think it's always important to talk about how those differ, for example, from psychoanalysis. So, all right, I'm going to share screen now. I don't know if I have any more videos, so I'll share sound just to be on the safe side. Okie dokie. Scooch this out of the way. Got all kinds of stuff falling. And get this thing. All right. So what Bandura really did, need to adjust that up. Okay, that's better. Now you can see my face. What Ventura really did was to build on operant conditioning. So if you remember, operant conditioning is where you are either reinforced or punished for your actions, and then if you're reinforced, you're more likely to do it again. If you're punished, you're less likely to do it again. So Skinner would describe things by the top model that's on this slide, right? So there's something that you watch, that becomes your antecedent. If we think back to our ABC model and all of its permeations, so individuals would see an antecedent. In this case, it would be the model, the person they're observing, and they would behave. That's their response, right? And then they'd be reinforced. So that's their consequence, their C, and that would then feed back into their response, and that would essentially determine whether they are more likely to repeat that response in the future. When we start to look at observational learning, or again, when we get into this social aspect of cognitive social learning theory, it gets a little more complicated, right? So you anticipate already that there will be reinforcement just by another person being there, right? As we've mentioned before, humans are social animals. Humans get reinforced just by being around other people, as long as they're not like in a feud with that person, right? Just by the nature of us as, these type of beings, we anticipate reinforcement just by the other person being there. So that's the first step of the bottom model, anticipated reinforcement. And then you would pay attention to the model, right? So if you don't pay attention to that other person, you're not going to learn anything, right? You have to actually put your focus on that other person. You still have that modeling stimuli that we see on the top model on this slide, but you respond in a much more complex way under Bandura's interpretation here. You code things, you rehearse things mentally by watching, and maybe, with the model. So we talked about, how they do the modeling in therapy, where you work with the therapist who's the model, right, to work up to like interacting with the snake for snake phobia. Then you get reinforced. There's a cognitive component here in this symbolic coding, cognitive organization, rehearsal. You're thinking. The observer is thinking. And remember, Skinner didn't care what happened up here, but Bandura certainly did. And everyone we're going to talk about after this very certainly did and does. Some of them are still alive. So, and Bandura is still alive, actually. I got to see him speak a few years ago, which was really cool. So Skinner would not have acknowledged or cared that people are thinking. Bandura was really interested in these cognitive processes. So what do you see when you watch a video of someone? What do you take away from it? What do you extract from it? And then how does that change your behavior? So he talked about these as efficacy expectations. That's a big part of why observational learning works. So there are 4 basic types of mechanisms. Performance accomplishments. This is the ability to carry out a task yourself. That's a reward in and of itself, right? When we accomplish a task, we feel really good about it, right? Like, hey, I was able to do that. That's awesome. Yesterday, I graded stuff for both my intro classes, Psych and WGS, and I thought I'd only be able to get through one of them, right? So I felt pretty good, right? That's a performance accomplishment. So by changing your performance, you can change behavior. Awesome. Then there's vicarious experience. This is that live or symbolic modeling. By watching what happens to the model, you are vicariously rewarded. The best analogy for this is watching sports, right? We are doing nothing. We are sitting on our couches, right? But we feel really good if our team wins, right? yeah, we won. Like, what did you do? Right? You sat there. But we have this feeling that like somehow we're involved in it. And that's that vicarious experience. And this is easy to slip into. Quick example. So as I've told you all, I follow gymnastics. And when Kyla Ross and Madison Koshin started at UCLA, I started following their team. And I was talking to my husband and I was like, oh, we won against Oklahoma. And he's like, we? Like, you have no other affinity with UCLA other than you like these two people. I was like, good point. Okay. And these all work. Next is verbal persuasion. Sorry, jumping ahead. Verbal persuasion is suggestion, instruction, interpretations, right? So when you are interacting with a live model, they'll often sort of give you feedback. So think about if you have been coached in sports or taken music lessons or dance lessons, right? Things along those lines. That person is with you, coaching you, maybe even showing you how to do what you need to do physically, right? And then there's emotional arousal, attribution, symbolic desensitization, symbolic exposure. And these all work by changing efficacy expectations. You think, I am able to do this, rather than I can't, I'm afraid of the snake, I'm too overwhelmed by everything. I could never play football, so why do I care, right? You're able to change that. Another idea that comes out of observational learning and is indicative of cognitive social learning theory in general is uniqueness. So where is personality in this model? In uniqueness, each of us is unique with regard to our circumstances. So if we think back to existentialism, it would be our thrownness, right? The circumstances into which we are born. Our personal factors are personal values, things like our attitudes, how we control ourselves, schema, which are underlying thought processes, behavioral abnormalities. Some of us just have quirks, right? And sometimes these are fine, and sometimes these are really problematic. Thinking of, driving Max and dropping Quinn off at preschool today, there's a guy sort of across the street and a few houses down from us who just like walks around outside barefoot no matter the weather, and like that's his behavioral quirk. Is it hurting anyone? No, right? But certainly abnormal compared to how other people in our neighborhood do things. And all of these will influence the development of personality and also how we react to the things around us, and also the actual circumstances around us, because our ideal circumstances are not always what happens, clearly. Right now, we're in a less than ideal circumstance, the fact that I do not have you directly in front of me, right? So we have to figure out how to make it work. And this is where the idea of reciprocal determinism comes into play. We're going to talk about this for a few slides, so you will get very used to this idea. This is the idea that everything is a reciprocal set of relationships. So it doesn't go in one direction. Everything feeds back into the other thing. That this sort of recognizes the complexity of the world, right? So if we react to the model in turn reacts back to us. So this is a clearer way of explaining reciprocal determinism, although initially you might look at it and go, no, it's not. But I swear it is. By the time we talk through it, I swear it'll be okay. So environmental contextual here is the situation, or if we think about it in terms of the antecedent, right? But also its consequences. So we're incorporating operant conditioning here, that reinforcement and that punishment. We're also looking at things like stressors and supports in our lives, right? Because they can determine how easy or hard it is to accomplish something. The personal is the person, their thoughts, their cognitions, their knowledge pre-existing or what they're learning, their beliefs, their attitudes, and their intentions. And then behavioral is what we do. So if we think about this in terms of the B, perhaps, in that A-B B, C, wherever we're putting all the letters model, right? These are our reactions. So skills that we have, problems we have to solve, things along those lines. And so if you notice, all of these arrows are no longer one-sided. They're all double-sided. All these things feed back into each other. So the conditions and the relationships are reciprocally determined. How you behave is going to affect your growth as a person, right? What you succeed at, what you fail at, what you get good reinforcement for, all of those things will feed back into your ideas about yourself, whether it's your self-efficacy, your personality, what have you. The person also influences the environment. And this is often the hardest thing for people to wrap their heads around, but we do, right? So again, think about other people as being part of the environment. Again, it's not usually just one-sided, right? If we're having a conversation or an interaction, right, we're gonna give them feedback as well as them giving us feedback. We also can change our environment, right? Stupid little examples. I felt like y'all couldn't see me, so I bought a ring light, right? Little change in my environment, but it can be larger reaching. So imagine that, you have someone who's in a horribly abusive relationship, right? With the right supports, this is not always possible, but with the right supports, those individuals may be able to change their situation by getting help at a shelter, right? But they've got to have the right supports in place, because otherwise it's not going to work, because the time you're at most risk for being killed is when you try to leave an abusive relationship. Okay, so those two things are going to be reciprocal. The environment itself influences behavior, right? What we have to face determines what we have to do. And the environment influences us personally, right? Even if we think of something as simple as where on earth we live. So I've been talking in my intro class with them about seasonal affective disorder, because we were talking about circadian rhythms. And one of my closest friends in grad school was from the Philippines and then moved to Ohio. And she had never had seasonal affective disorder before, but not surprisingly, she developed it right when she moved to Ohio. But she got one of the light therapy boxes, and that helped, and she was fine, right? But the environment clearly influenced the personal for her. And then that influenced her behavior of having to buy and set up this thing. The person influences behavior, right? We can choose what behaviors we are going to do. And our behavior is going to change and shape the environment. How other people react to us. Sometimes the physical environment, right? If we garden or do a renovation on our house, right? Things along those lines. We can think about this in terms of masks, right? If we wear our masks, then we are keeping our environment safe. So if we take the ABC model and we map it onto the chart we just looked at, here's what it looks like. So the environment is both your antecedent and the source of your consequences, because it's the other people, or even, sometimes the physical environment, that will give us those consequences, right? The P is obviously the person, and then the B is your behavior. So here you have your ABC model, but it's incorporating the P as well. I'm pointing to my screen like y'all can see me, but imagine you can't see my hand. So again, taking this, what we've been looking at sort of linearly, and recognizing that, in fact, it's all reciprocal, right? So, but how did we really take this and apply it to modeling, right? Because that seems pretty complicated. Well, we have this, right? So in person one, the model, right? We have the antecedent, the activating situation, whatever it is. Let's use Bandura's study as an example, because it'll be easy to help us conceptualize. So our antecedent here might be, Bandura told me to beat up this Bobo doll in this particular way, right? I'm the adult model. And then so P, I'm the person, I'm the model. So I myself have signed up to do this for whatever reason, right? And then my behavior is going to be beating up the Bobo doll in the way that he told me. And the consequences are nothing negative to me, right? And that's why it works as a model, because I'm not being punished for doing so. And then the overall consequences are Bandura now has the stimulus for his experiment. And so the actions of person one become the antecedents for person two, the observer. So person one is the model, person two is the observer. So their antecedent, their activating situation is person one, is watching person one. So here, person two, the P is the person, the observer. They can learn by observing. B is the behavior they decide to engage in. So if we think of those kids in the Bandura Bobo doll study, they go and beat up the Bobo doll in the same way, or come up with new creative ways to do it, like beating it up with the doll, right? Or throwing the ball at it. And the consequences. And these can be self-generated, where you sort of, again, pat yourself on the back or beat yourself up, or they can be external. And the kids, I think, their consequences were they're just having fun, and they didn't get any negative consequences for engaging in these behaviors, at least not from Bandura. There might have been things down the line. We don't know. He didn't really follow them up. Know that the information you learn by observational learning could be applied right then, like it was with the kids, or it could be applied much later. So you may have lessons that you learned from watching other people years ago, and you apply them now, right? And I do this all the time when I'm teaching. You know, I've told you all how much Levine and Newberry influenced me. So when I do, you know, my Cookie Monster id impression, like that is me. I am person two here, and Newberry was person one doing that in class when I was a grad student. All right, so I still remember that. I still emulate that years later. So the functions of vicarious consequences. What do you learn by observational learning? One is motivational. Why should I do this, right? Why should I do this task? One is informational. How do I do it, right? Again, think about learning a skill, a sport, something like that. One is emotional. The person you're watching in situation A may have bad things happen. So you can be observationally afraid. This is one of the reasons why we like scary movies, right? Is because we don't actually put ourselves in mortal danger, but we get that sort of scary feeling. And I remember a study came out a couple years ago about how, like, especially for teens, that gets tied up in your hormones. And like, you can also feel like sexually excited at that point. Not that the scariness is, but it's just sort of like, then you could like be primed to make out with somebody or something. So the adrenaline rush, all right? Or it could be the opposite. Maybe someone does something and they seem to enjoy it a lot, so you try it to get the same feeling. And this, again, can be something really positive, like, ooh, that dance move looks fun, I'm gonna try it. Or it can be really negative, potentially, like, ooh, that person looks like they're having some fun on cocaine, I'm gonna try it, right? Cocaine is one of the list of, like, I have lists when I talk about substance abuse of, like, these are the drugs you should probably never put in your system because of what they do to your brain, and cocaine is one of them. Or you may have never seen a snake in the wild, but you've watched snakes on a plane. And so now you personally are afraid of snakes, right? Or kids pick up their parents' phobias sometimes. And unfortunately, this translates to people picking up, you know, racism from other people in their lives, things along those. Kids aren't born racist, right? They have to learn to be racist. So it's our responsibility to try to teach them to be anti-racist. I'm looking at what Miranda read here. There are memes and jokes about that. How impressionable people start becoming as their friends, and they adopt the facets of their personalities over time. Yes. So my husband's best friend, who was the best man in our wedding, when they've spent a weekend together, he comes back and he talks just like Jonathan. And I'm like, oh, I hear it. But I'm just as guilty. When I'm around my friend Nina, who's from Canada, I come back saying A. So it's certainly something that we all do. Then there's valuative, which is you can change, observing can change your idea of the person, right? So if you see the model and you associate positive consequences, then you might be like, ooh, I want to do that too. And this is why they use attractive people and famous people in ads for things, because you kind of think like, I want to be like them. I can have that too if I buy that product, even though we know that's not the case, right? Even as rational people, we want that association. Oh yeah, Southern accent. Yep, that'll happen. One of my friends from internship was a good old boy from Georgia. He was the only one of us who was from Georgia. And he actually like taught us Deep South vernacular. Like I learned what fixin' meant from him and things like that. So yeah, when I'm around him, that happens. Yes, repeating things people say, things along those lines. We do this from movies to pick up on phrases and use them either jokingly or not, right? Big example I can think of right now is Chelsea Memel is trying to make a comeback in gymnastics and her dad is her coach. And he decided that fetch is going to be his thing. He's going to actually make fetch a word. So every Instagram post he makes, he hashtags fetch. You know, do like that.
My roommate likes to joke that I have a superpower because if I hear anybody talking with a strong dialect for more than about 10 minutes, I pick it up and will use it for the next 2 or 3 days without even knowing what I'm doing.
Yep, that can definitely happen. Especially if you're someone who, for example, sings by ear. It's a lot easier to pick that up because that's sort of how you process things. Yeah. And then also related to this is influenceability. So when you're trying to be like someone else, or you think if someone else can do it, I can too, right? All those things will come in. So person variables. So we're going to talk about Michel again. You all just did the reading from him last week. So this is his personality coefficient. Again, coming back to it. He says it's about 0.4. So we're going way back to the beginning of the semester when we talked about this. So the personality coefficient is about 0.4. It's a small correlation. And then he uses that R squared thing that Funder's not a fan of. So he says personality is only 16% of the variance explained by traits. So he says there's 84% not explained. And again, remember, Funder says this technique, the statistical method is not good, but Michel used it to say there are not personality traits. So then the question we were left with after reading him and Allport and our Blackboard reading was, okay, so what are they, right, if they're not traits? And Michel argued they are expectancies, or he called them person variables. And so this is why this is here. We're relating to the idea of expectancies from observational learning. So example here, imagine asking someone out. And if you say to yourself, I know they'll probably say no, that's an expectation. It's how qualities of a person influence the impact of varying situations, right? And if you think to yourself, they are probably going to say no, A, you might not bother, right? B, when you do ask them out, it might be like, some, right? And that's not very convincing, right? As opposed to like being assertive and personable. So again, self-efficacy comes into this. Skinner would say that behavior is a function of consequences, but Bandura says that behavior is a function of expectancies of consequences. So Bandura says it's not just the consequences you get, it's the fact that maybe you've had those consequences before, so you expect those consequences, and that's what's gonna hold you back or keep you doing that behavior. So it's not because you've been punished in the past, it's because you've been punished in the past and you now expect to be punished again. So you need that cognitive piece, right? That's what Bandura really emphasized. And Michel would be okay with Bandura saying that. Michel would be on board. So there are what could be called these person variables, and these differ between individuals. And again, if we want to use our own vernacular, traits, right? And they can also differ within someone's life depending on the situation. And here's where Michelle's idea comes in more, right? So some competencies here. These are both behavioral in terms of I can do this, and cognitive in terms of I believe I can do this. So rules are what you have to follow, maybe set by society or your parents or the sport you're playing, right? Or we set them for ourselves. And sometimes when we set them for ourselves, they're completely unrealistic, right? Like, I have to do everything perfectly. Are you a deity? Like, no one can do that, right? Skills, what you are able to do. And then problem-solving strategies, how you can use your mental abilities to help yourself in given situations. So a bit more about expectancies here. Behavior outcome expectancies come out of upper conditioning. You do a certain behavior, you expect certain outcomes. So you expect that if you do hard work and you have some persistence and some ability, you'll get a good grade in Dr. X's class, right? Then there's self-behavior or self-stimulus efficacy. These are expectations about yourself and your ability to react to a stimulus. I'm capable of hard work. I'm capable of persistence. I have some ability. Therefore, I think I can achieve a good grade in Dr. X's class. And then stimulus outcome is stimulus. This is classical conditioning. You learn what the stimulus means, good or bad, they associate. And so your idea would be Dr. X rewards students fairly. Therefore, if I do all the tasks for the class, I should get a good grade. So an extreme example of expectancies is learned helplessness, which was first developed by Martin Seligman. And now we're really starting to get to the cognitive part of cognitive social learning theory. So this is related to the lack of perceived control over life events. He showed this through a series of studies with dogs, where he would shock their feet, nothing that would harm them, but certainly be annoying, right? And he basically, for some of the dogs, he built a wall to the top of the cage so they couldn't get over it. And other dogs had a little wall where they could just hop over it and get to the other side, and then their feet wouldn't be shocked anymore. So clearly, through the principle of negative reinforcement, right, taking away something they don't want, those dogs would learn to do that pretty quickly. Those who were initially not allowed to get away learned there was no possible escape. And thus, even when you took that wall away, they didn't try to get out. They didn't try to hop over the short wall because they didn't think escape was possible. So he called this learned helplessness, and this has often been called a depressive attributional style as well. So this is implicated in depression. So the idea is you make internal attributions. I can't do anything about this. Nothing in the environment seems to change, so something I did must have been my fault. Stable attributions, future negative outcomes are not going to change. This is going to suck forever, right? And global attribution. This is going to disrupt all parts of my life. All three domains can contribute to this sense of hopelessness. So here's a diagram that talks about that. So again, if you make internal stable global attributions, you can say, you end up saying essentially there's nothing I could do about this. I failed my psych test today, I have anxiety, it's never gonna get better, there's nothing I can do about it, right? Whereas if you make more unstable or specific things, then you can find ways to overcome.
Is this the same concept as like when you have a child whose parents do everything for them? So for example, if they're trying to draw a picture and they struggle with doing it, the parent draws it for them. And then eventually they get to the point where they just say that they can't do it so that someone else will.
Yeah, I mean, sure, this could play in the same way. But this is more about the negative feeling of you can't do it, like the lack of self-efficacy. But I could see, Shai, how that could come about if you're never allowed to do things for yourself, right? I remember reading, there's a great book about self-esteem. I'm not going to remember the author's name now, but he really talked about exactly what you're talking about in terms of like, if you don't let kids try stuff and fail, they never build up their self-esteem because they don't believe they can do it. So yeah, I think that that's definitely a piece of this. Yeah. So in terms of encoding strategies, people differ in the ways they pay attention to and organize the incoming information. So here's we're getting back to schemas. I've heard these called schemas or schemata, and some people just call them core beliefs or cognitive structures. But this is an organized cluster of attitudes, beliefs, and assumptions. And that is going to be the lens through which you interpret sensory events and how you respond to them, right? So if your schemas are, I can't do anything, and I'm never going to be able to do anything because things are never going to get better, you're going to actually not do anything, right? So these really make a difference. These are relatively stable and enduring, and they affect the way we perceive and know about the world. And they're also mental shortcuts that allow us to process information very quickly. So these are some examples of depressive schemata in particular. So this is an example that Levine gave us because he forgot to bring the handout to class one day. So, memories, that time I forgot the handout. Generalizations, I make a mess of everything because you forgot the handout once, right? So you could take this in a depressive schema, attitudes, I'm a failure, I'm worthless. And the beliefs that drive this is I must be competent at everything, I must never forget anything. So you're not allowing yourself any slack. So if you fail in that, even just, I forgot the handout and I have to walk back to my office, which is like 20 feet away, right? Then you are going to think of yourself as a failure. So what we've really worked up to here is cognitive theory, which feeds into cognitive therapy. And the main idea here is that our cognitions, our thoughts, are what cause our negative consequences and our negative emotions. So it's not the A by itself. It's not the situation. It is our thoughts about the situation. And there are two main theorists here. We'll talk about both. You'll read an article from each of them for Wednesday. So Ellis came up with rational emotive behavioral therapy, or REBT. And then Beck came up with cognitive behavioral therapy, which we initially called cognitive therapy, or CT. Both these guys added behavior later when it was sort of like trendy to do so, but they always had behavioral things in there. All right, so Ellis, he was alive till 2007. He was American. He studied with Karen Horney. So again, he was studying psychoanalysis, so he had to be psychoanalyzed. So he was psychoanalyzed by Horney. And then they had a falling out, but Ellis really borrowed from, took a lot of her ideas and put it into his work. He really admired Adler. Ellis was interested in the goals people make, which Adler referred to as the fictions people create. If you think back to that McAdams article at the very beginning of the semester with the cocktail party, right? These are the third level traits. So in therapy, Adler told stories, he made jokes, he made up little songs related to therapy, he gave homework assignments, which Adler had done some of. And so his therapy was really problem focused, as was Adler's. So how can we get the patient beyond yes, but, right, to actually working on changing? So Ellis really admired this direct problem-solving context and borrowed from that for his therapy as well. He also really liked Wolpe, who was an early cognitive or really behavioral therapist, honestly. And he came up with that systematic desensitization we talked about of working up to whatever you're afraid of. So he liked that behavioral component for the treatment of phobias. And then Eysenck, he really liked the research component. Eysenck was one of the first great behavioral therapists. He looked at psychoanalysis and said, this is ineffective, but we can do better. He looked at research and said, it doesn't work. And in fact, psychoanalysis can be harmful. And again, Ellis really liked that idea of how can we do this better. And although he was not a great admirer of Rogers, Ellis's therapy really is somewhat humanistic. He did believe in the essential dignity of human beings and infused that into his therapy. So he developed rational motive therapy, and as I said, he later called it rational motive behavioral therapy, and he argued it had always been behavioral, and he wanted to sort of follow the trends, including that. He founded the Albert Ellis Institute. He was really a clinician, first and foremost, and he did the teaching of this. So he famously had these Friday night seminars that the public could attend for, I think, just a very small fee, where he would teach different things about REBT. And he wrote a lot of popular books, but he didn't do as much research per se, although he certainly did some. So in REBT, the idea is that people can solve their problems with rational thought. So the ABCs here, again, are different. And so here the B from behavior becomes beliefs, which really chose to change it up, right? So we still have the antecedents, and Ellis said we should focus on the B of beliefs. This is a huge change and very important to the cognitive idea of therapy. We still have the consequences, but Ellis added a D for disputation, which I'll explain over the next few slides. But the focus really was on the B. Are your beliefs rational or are they irrational? You want to make this distinction, and that's why he called it rational emotive therapy. So in terms of the B, you could have irrational beliefs. And these, again, sort of call back to some of the people he really admired. There's a human tendency to transform what you'd like to have into what you must have. So these are Adler's basic mistakes. These are Horney's neurotic needs. The idea of the musts and shoulds, he liberally took that from Horney's work. He kind of stole the idea of the tyranny of the shoulds. Remember, again, he was psychoanalyzed by her, so he was very familiar with it. Irrational beliefs are self-defeating, but they're also self-perpetuating. These shoulds, oughts, musts, got to, can'ts are associated with negative feelings. And so these become the equivalent, if we're going to think of it in Rogerian terms, conditions of worth that you place on yourself. Irrational beliefs add to anxiety, guilt, anger, depression. They're not constructive in any way, shape, or form. Ellis, again, liked to use his humor, so he called these awfulizing or masturbating. He was a funny guy. And so you got these undesirable consequences, again, of feeling depressed, feeling anxious, feeling angry, feeling worthless. The goal is to get to rational beliefs. And these distinguish what you'd like to have happen and what you can do to have it happen and what you can actually expect to happen. So these are preferences or wishes instead of you must do this. They're authentic, they're constructive emotions, there's positive motivation behind them, self-nurturance in here, taking care of yourself, recognizing you can't do everything. So the C, the consequences. Again, remember, these are the consequences now of your beliefs, not of your behavior. because Ellis has changed things up on us. So consequences of believing these negative things about yourself, powerful negative emotions, escape behavior, wanting to run away. That's tied to the avoidance that we've talked about in terms of getting that negative reinforcement for avoiding things you're anxious about. Ineffectiveness, right? Because you believe you can't do something, you don't do it, or you don't do it well. And then they also lead to further negative self-evaluation, truly in that reciprocal determinism, right? Where the consequences rebound and affect your beliefs. Well, it didn't happen, so obviously it's because I suck as a human. And then much of his therapy is made up of the D, the disputation. So people learn what these beliefs are, these irrational beliefs, and then they learn to change them and challenge them in this disputation step. So these methods can be cognitive, where you actually dispute your thoughts. These can be emotive, helping people realize what the emotional consequences are of having these negative thoughts and really trying to change those emotions by changing those thoughts. And then behavioral. So here again, he's borrowing from Adler in using the acting as if. Go out and act as if you're not depressed. Go out and act as if you're not anxious, right? And it shows you can do it. So this is really you challenging your sense of what you can and cannot do. It's all about self-efficacy. And so I'm going to get to, I have like 2 minutes, I can pull this up. I'm going to get to the handouts I sent you all on Friday. So let me pull it up real quick here, our learning handouts, and I will do a new share. Okay. Scoot the chat out of the way so you don't have a black box over everything. Okay. I'm not going to go over this big chart right now. We can touch base back on that on Wednesday. But this is one of the ways that Ellis worked on disputation. And modern cognitive therapies often use this exact sheet. So this is called an ABC sheet. And the idea is you actually write down your activating event and your consequence is usually where we start clients, because it takes them a while to recognize what they're actually telling themselves, right? So something happens and I feel and do something. So then you go back and you say, okay, what are you telling yourself about that activating event that makes you, experience those consequences? And then what you work up to is disputation. Does it make sense to tell yourself this belief? What can you tell yourself instead in the future? And then let me rotate this, because when I scanned it, I didn't obviously put it all in the same direction. Okay. So what he ended up doing was taking that ABC and expanding it. So you don't need to know about all these sort of like extra things here in consequences, but disputation. So, questions about this, and then he actually went and added an E in terms of once you dispute it, how do you feel? Do you feel better? So let me show you an example real quick, and then we'll wrap up class. So your activating event here is I'm meeting with Rick, a coworker, about an upcoming in-service. Your irrational beliefs here was Rick must not see how poorly prepared I am. I should be in complete control. It would be horrible if Rick rejects me. But you also might have some rational thoughts. I want to help. I want to do a good job. And so your emotional consequences are disappointment, anxiety. You might be panicky, guilty, things along those lines. You might end up procrastinating as a result of your anxiety. And here are those disputing questions. Why is it catastrophic if other people see me unprepared? Why should Rick, of all people, destroy me with his anger, right? And then you talk about the effects of the disputation. Like, okay, it's unpleasant to be judged, it'd be inconvenient, but this is the biggest thing. I could stand it if it happened. This is a huge bit. So like it's not rosy. It's not like everything's going to be perfect all the time. But the idea is, if this happens, could you stand it? Could you survive it? And the idea, once you work through this, is, yeah, like it's gonna not be pleasant, but I can do it, right? Okay, so we do have some more stuff that I will go over on Wednesday before our discussion, where we'll talk about Beck, who again, you'll do a reading by. And that is it for today. So I'll do my normal hanging out for a couple minutes in case anybody has questions. And if not, I will see you all on Wednesday.
Bye, Professor Myers.